The Red Sea, at 3:22 a.m., does not announce itself. It does not offer the kind of dramatic geography that prepares a crew for what is coming. There are no mountains on the horizon, no dramatic coastline, no navigational choke point that forces attention to a single, focal point. There is only the dark water and the low, humid air that sits on the surface like a second ocean stacked on the first, and the faint smell of diesel and salt that has been present since the ship left Djibouti 46 hours ago. And the amber glow of the Combat Information Center screens that paint every face the same color as old photographs. The U.S. Navy Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer was conducting maritime security operations in the southern Red Sea corridor, a patrol route that had become one of the most contested stretches of open water on the planet since Houthi forces reactivated their maritime interdiction campaign in early March 2026. The ceasefire that had briefly suspended Houthi drone and missile operations in October 2025 had lasted exactly 143 days before collapsing, under the weight of the broader regional escalation that followed the February 28th strikes on Iran. Within 72 hours of those strikes, Houthi command elements in Sana'a had issued a formal declaration that all coalition naval vessels operating in the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Arabian Sea were designated as legitimate military targets in solidarity with what they called the defense of the Islamic resistance. The destroyer's commanding officer had read that declaration. Every senior officer aboard had read it. It had been included in the pre-deployment threat briefing, reproduced in the operational orders from Fifth Fleet, and discussed in the daily intelligence summary that arrived in the ship's communication suite each morning at 0600. The declaration was not unexpected. The operational environment had been assessed as high threat before the ship ever departed its home port. The crew had trained for exactly the scenario that was about to materialize. None of that training fully prepares a human body for the moment the threat becomes real. At 3:22 a.m., the SPY-1D phased array radar system registered the first contact. Then a second. Then, in the 11 seconds that followed, contacts began resolving with a rapidity that caused the watch team's collective posture to change. A physical response, a tightening of shoulders, a leaning forward toward screens, a quality of stillness that is the inverse of relaxation. By 3:23 a.m., the system had resolved 53 discrete inbound contacts, bearing from the northeast on vectors consistent with launch points in the coastal highlands of western Yemen, approximately 190 nautical miles distant. 53 contacts, a mix of track signatures that the Aegis combat system processed and classified in under 2 seconds. The majority bearing the low radar cross-section profile consistent with one-way attack drone airframes, subsonic, commercially derived, packed with enough shaped charge, explosive material to penetrate a superstructure and initiate a catastrophic internal fire. But embedded within the drone swarm, the system had identified something else. 7 contacts presenting ballistic trajectory profiles, not drones, ballistic missiles, maneuvering re-entry vehicles, anti-ship variant, capable of terminal velocity in excess of Mach 2.5, with seekers designed to acquire a surface vessel's radar and thermal signature at the point of re-entry, and guide the warhead to impact with a precision that rendered evasive maneuvering at short range essentially irrelevant. This was not the same tactical architecture as a pure drone swarm. This was a combined arms engagement. Drones designed to saturate the outer and mid-range defensive layers, to force the ship to expend SM-6 inventory and generate engagement scheduling conflicts, and the ballistic missiles arriving behind the drone wave in the window created by that expenditure, when the ship's interceptor count was reduced and the crew's cognitive bandwidth was stretched to its absolute limit. The tactical action officer made the weapon's free call at 3:23:44 a.m. His voice on the internal circuit was flat, controlled, and devoid of any inflection that would have communicated the information his body was simultaneously transmitting to every nerve ending it possessed. The first SM-6 left the forward VLS magazine at 3:23:51 a.m. In the Combat Information Center, the engagement scheduling software was running the mathematics that no human mind could process at the required speed. 53 inbound contacts, 7 ballistic tracks in terminal phase, interceptor inventory allocated, probability of kill calculated for each pairing, fire control channels assigned. The system was not choosing randomly. It was prioritizing, waiting, making tactical decisions in milliseconds that a human tactical action officer with unlimited time would have needed minutes to work through. The man at the console was not directing the engagement in the traditional sense. He was supervising a process of almost incomprehensible speed and complexity, watching the tactical picture update in real time, ready to override if the system's logic diverged from his tactical judgment, but fundamentally trusting the architecture that the engineers had spent 3 decades refining. The first ballistic intercept happened at 3:24:38 a.m. A single SM-6, guided by the ship's fire control solution and transitioning to its own terminal seeker in the final seconds, met an incoming ballistic missile warhead at an altitude of approximately 60,000 feet and converted both vehicles into an expanding sphere of superheated metal fragments. On the radar display, the 2 tracks merged into a single return and then dispersed into debris, scatter. The crew had no sensory experience of this event. It happened 11 miles above the sea surface, invisible to the naked eye, audible only as a faint crackling in the electronic noise floor of the radar systems. Below, on the water, the drone wave was closing. The drone swarm's approach geometry had been designed with an intelligence that was uncomfortable to acknowledge. The 53 airframes were not flying in formation. They were distributed across an attack front spanning approximately 14 nautical miles, arriving from 4 distinct bearing sectors simultaneously, ensuring that the ship's CIWS coverage arcs, which were formidable but not omnidirectional, could not address all inbound contacts from a single defensive orientation. The ship's helm was receiving automated course correction recommendations from the combat system every 90 seconds as the engagement geometry evolved. Each recommendation, an attempt to optimize the ship's aspect angle relative to the most threatening bearing sectors. At 3:26 a.m., the electronic warfare system detected a frequency-hopping datalink operating in the 900 MHz band, a command and control signal connecting a subset of the incoming drones to a ground-based controller somewhere in the coastal highlands. This was unexpected. The pre-mission intelligence had assessed the attack profile as fully autonomous, with terminal guidance provided by onboard optical and radar seekers. The presence of a live human controller in the loop meant the attack was being actively managed, that someone with situational awareness was watching the defensive response unfold and issuing real-time guidance corrections to redirect specific airframes toward sectors identified as momentarily less defended. The electronic warfare supervisor recommended immediate jamming of the identified frequency band. The tactical action officer authorized it. The ship's jamming systems began transmitting suppression energy across the band, and for approximately 40 seconds, 11 of the inbound drone contacts began exhibiting erratic flight path deviations, evidence that the jamming was interrupting the data link and forcing those airframes to revert to autonomous terminal guidance. 3 of the 11 entered flight path spirals, consistent with terminal guidance failure, and impacted the sea surface more than 8 nautical miles from the ship. Then the data link shifted frequency. The ground controller had anticipated the jamming response and had programmed a frequency hopping protocol that cycled across 17 pre-selected bands at irregular intervals. The electronic warfare system identified the new frequency within 4.2 seconds, and the suppression transmitter retargeted. But the window had allowed the diverted drones to reacquire stable guidance. The crew of 8 in the ship's electronic warfare space were now fighting their own engagement. A battle of frequency spectrum and signal processing and human reaction time that was running simultaneously with the physical weapons engagement in the outer defensive rings. A second ballistic missile intercept at 3:27 a.m. Clean. A third at 3:27:31 a.m. with a debris scatter pattern that produced a brief secondary radar return at medium altitude before the fragments dispersed below detection threshold. 4 ballistic missiles remained in terminal phase. At 3:28 a.m., the aft VLS magazine experienced a firing interruption on cells 3 and 4. The cause was a pressure fault in the launch gas generation system, a mechanical issue that the damage control system flagged immediately and that the engineering watch was already moving to address, but which in the immediate term removed 2 ready interceptor cells from the ship's available inventory at the exact moment when inventory was the critical variable. The tactical action officer was informed of the fault in real time. He acknowledged it, adjusted his interceptor allocation in the engagement scheduling system to compensate for the reduction in aft sector coverage, and continued. This was the systemic stress that the training scenarios had modeled, but that felt fundamentally different when the training scenario was the present reality. A ship was not a perfectly controlled laboratory. It was a machine with thousands of interdependent systems, operating in a high-stress, electromagnetic and mechanical environment. And some of those systems would fail at the worst possible moments. The crew's preparation for this reality, the drills, the maintenance, the battle damage control training, was the margin between a fault that was managed and a fault that cascaded. The ESSM engagement layer activated at 3:28:30 a.m. The drone wave had penetrated to within 15 nautical miles, despite the SM-6 attrition that had reduced the inbound count from 53 to 31. 31 drone airframes, plus 4 ballistic tracks still in terminal descent, bearing down on a single ship from 3 directions simultaneously. The evolved Sea Sparrow missiles began their work with a pace that consumed launcher availability at a rate the system's designers had intended only for the most extreme scenarios. The VLS quad packs fired in ripples, the smoke trails from each launch visible on the ship's own external cameras as white streaks departing the hull at angles that seemed almost casual, almost relaxed, before the rocket's acceleration carried them beyond visual range in under 3 seconds. In the electronic domain, the fire control radars were tracking more simultaneous targets than they had ever been required to manage outside of developmental testing. And the thermal load on the array cooling systems was rising toward the threshold that would trigger automatic power reduction. The ship's helicopter, which had been conducting surface search operations 12 miles to the southeast, was recalled to immediate hover at a safe distance. The pilot reported via secure voice that from his altitude and position, the ship appeared to be surrounded by a pattern of white smoke, columns and distant flashpoints that resembled, his exact words, recorded in the engagement transcript, a constellation of defensive fire, each point of light representing a weapon in flight, each weapon representing a decision made in fractions of a second by a system that had been built to stand between a ship full of people and a force that intended to remove those people from the equation. 3 of the 4 remaining ballistic missiles were intercepted in a compressed time frame between 3:29 a.m. and 3:30 a.m. The intercepts required 2 SM-6 rounds each for the first 2, the initial intercept achieving a proximity detonation that degraded but did not fully neutralize the incoming warhead, necessitating a follow-up shot. The engagement scheduling software had anticipated this possibility and pre-allocated the follow-on interceptors. The 3rd ballistic target was a clean single-round kill. The 4th ballistic track was not intercepted in the outer ring. It was a variant that the intelligence community had assessed as an emerging capability, but had not yet confirmed as operationally deployed. A re-entry vehicle with a terminal phase maneuver capability that altered its descent trajectory in the final 8 seconds of flight, executing a lateral offset that changed its predicted impact point by approximately 200 yards, and generated a new fire control solution problem for the ship's systems that required a solution update cycle that consumed 3.1 seconds. The SM-6 that had been allocated to this track arrived at the predicted intercept point and found only empty sky. The target had moved. The ESSM system acquired the track on its backup fire control channel. The engagement was executed at a range of 4 nautical miles. The ballistic warhead was neutralized at an altitude of approximately 1,400 feet, directly above the ship's port. Quarter. The fragmentation pattern from the detonation impacted the ship's port side antenna array and the forward edge of the port bridge wing. 3 sailors standing damage control watch at a port side station reported being struck by fragments debris bidemries, not penetrating wounds, but concussive impacts that required immediate medical assessment. The ship's corpsman was on station within 90 seconds. 2 sailors were returned to watch station after evaluation. 1 was transferred to the sick bay with a suspected fractured wrist from a fragment impact on his forearm. This was the first casualty of the engagement. The first moment when the mathematical abstraction of the tactical display, track contacts and probability of kill assessments and interceptor allocation counts translated into a specific human body experiencing specific physical damage in a specific compartment of a real ship. The drone count at 3:31 a.m. stood at 19 inbound contacts. The ESSM engagements had reduced the wave but had not eliminated it. 19 drone airframes, some flying the sea-skimming profiles that challenge the fire control solution, some executing erratic terminal maneuvers consistent with active human guidance via the still functional datalink, were now inside 8 nautical miles. The failing systems, both the forward and aft mounts, began their acquisition and tracking sequences. The 20mm systems operate at a rate that produces a sound unlike anything else in the naval weapons inventory. Not a series of discrete shots, but a sustained mechanical phenomenon. A tearing sound that exists at a frequency the human body registers before the conscious mind processes it, that vibrates in the chest cavity and the sinuses, and produces an instinctive physical response that years of training can manage but cannot fully eliminate. The forward phalanx engaged its first contact at 3:31:14 a.m., eliminated at 1,200 yards. Second contact, 940 yards. Third, 711 yards. The aft phalanx was engaged simultaneously, working the contacts bearing from the ship's southern sectors. The two systems creating overlapping fields of fire that covered the most threatening approach vectors. 12 contacts were eliminated in the CIWS engagement window over the following 70 seconds. That left 7. 7 drone airframes that had survived the SM-6 outer ring, survived the ESSM mid-ring, survived the initial CIWS engagement, and were now inside 400 yards, a range at which the engagement timeline compressed to a scale where human perception became inadequate, and the autonomous systems were making decisions faster than the conscious minds of the people nominally responsible for them. The phalanx forward mount engaged 2 contacts at 287 yards and 244 yards in a rapid succession. The barrel traverse speed taxed to its limits as the director software calculated the intercept geometry for 2 nearly simultaneous targets, approaching from slightly divergent bearings. The electronic warfare system achieved a partial guidance disruption on a third contact at 180 yards. Not a clean neutralization, but a guidance interrupt sufficient to cause the airframe to nose over and impact the water 30 yards from the hull, close enough that the water column from the impact was visible on the bridge cameras, as a white spout that rose and collapsed in under 2 seconds. Close enough that the sailors on the bridge felt the concussive pressure of the impact through the hull plating. The phalanx aft mount neutralized a 4th and 5th contact at 320 yards and 198 yards. 2 contacts remained. They were the last 2 airframes of a 53-unit swarm that had launched from the Yemeni coastal highlands approximately 40 minutes earlier, that had been subjected to the full spectrum of the U.S. Navy's layered defensive architecture and had survived everything. They were the 2%. The statistical tale of a saturation attack. The drones that the mathematics of probability had always suggested might exist on the far end of the distribution. The threats that got through the outer ring, because their approach angle was optimal. Through the ESSM, because of engagement scheduling conflicts. Through the initial CIWS, because of fire control solution latency. Through the first phalanx burst, because the geometric solution required a reacquisition cycle. The phalanx forward mount achieved its reacquisition and engaged the 6th contact at 47 yards. 47 yards from the hull of a destroyer carrying a crew of 287 sailors. The detonation of the drone's shaped charge warhead, initiated by the kinetic impact of the 20mm tungsten projectiles, produced a pressure wave that blew out 2 bridge windows and knocked a quartermaster off his feet. The fragment pattern from the airframe's disintegration scored the forward superstructure across a 6-foot vertical swath and severed a signal cable running to the forward communications antenna assembly. The ship shuddered with the energy of the detonation, a full-body vibration that every person aboard felt simultaneously, that produced in the Combat Information Center a moment of absolute, suspended silence, a gap in time between the event and the cognitive processing of its outcome, between the shockwave and the breath. The 7th contact was eliminated by the aft phalanx at 91 yards. At 3:34 a.m., the radar display showed 0 inbound contacts. The Combat Information Center was quiet. Not the quiet of normalcy or relief. A different quiet. The kind that accumulates in the space after something has tried very hard to end everyone in the room and failed. And everyone in the room is aware simultaneously that the failure was not by much, and that the margin between what happened and what could have happened is measured in yards and seconds, and individual mechanical decisions made by systems operating faster than human thought. The commanding officer stood at the center console. His hands were on the edge of the display surface, and he was looking at the tactical picture. A clean picture now, empty sky, settled surface contacts, no threats. He looked at the fragments scoring on the forward superstructure camera feed. He looked at the medical status report that showed one sailor in sick bay. He looked at the VLS inventory screen that showed the ship's interceptor count reduced to 22% of its pre-engagement load. He made his transmission to 5th Fleet at 3:36 a.m. The numbers entered into the engagement log reflected the arithmetic of a new kind of warfare. 53 drone airframes, 7 ballistic missiles, 48 minutes of continuous multi-domain combat, 61 interceptors expended, SM-6, ESSM, and a follow-up shot allocation that the pre-engagement planning had modeled as a worst-case scenario. 4,840 rounds of 20mm CIWS ammunition. Port antenna array damaged. Bridge windows destroyed. Signal cable severed. One sailor with a fractured wrist, sustained in the fragmentation event from the neutralized 4th ballistic track. 2 additional sailors treated and returned to duty. 1 guided missile destroyer. Afloat. Operational. Continuing assigned patrol. The cost of that outcome would take weeks to fully account. The physical damage could be repaired. The antenna, the windows, the cable, the sailor's wrist. But the strategic cost was harder to repair on any timeline. The ship's interceptor inventory had been reduced to a level that would require a return to a replenishment point before it could credibly defend against another coordinated saturation attack of equivalent scale. That replenishment cycle would take time. During that time, the ship's presence in the patrol area would be maintained, but its defensive capacity would be degraded in ways that the adversary's intelligence apparatus would almost certainly detect and attempt to exploit. The sailors in the Combat Information Center began the post-engagement procedures. The system logs, the weapons expenditure reports, the electronic warfare data capture, the maintenance checks on the systems that had run for 48 minutes at intensities beyond their routine operating parameters. The smell of ozone was heavier now, a tangible chemical presence in the recycled air. The smell of radar arrays and electronic warfare systems that had given everything they had. In the sickbay, the corpsman was setting the fractured wrist. The sailor, a fire controlman, 23 years old, looked at the ceiling and said nothing. There was nothing to say. The math had worked. The systems had performed. The architecture had held. Almost. 31 yards. 47 yards. 91 yards. These were not statistics. These were the distances by which a ship full of people continued to exist after 53 airframes and 7 ballistic warheads attempted to resolve the question of their existence in the negative. The distances were small enough to be humbling and large enough to be survivable, and the line between those two conditions was everything. The Red Sea does not care about any of this. It was dark and flat and humid at 3:22 a.m. when the first contact resolved, and it was dark and flat and humid at 3:34 a.m. when the last one disappeared. The sea does not keep records of the engagements fought on its surface. The record is kept by the people who stood the watch, and by the single line in an operational log that says, "Ship operational, crew intact, mission continues." That line is the margin between the world that exists and the world that almost did.